Our local fishing boats are facing a new threat, one which is opposed by the East Coast fishing industry and environmentalists. They say a controversial fishing method which stuns fish is devastating fishing grounds. But is that the whole story? Richard Daniel has this.
I'm out in the North Sea to find out why trawlers like this one have triggered an unlikely alliance between conservation groups and our fishing fleet.
Well, underneath on the seabed, as he's towing that equipment along, they're pulsing electricity into the seabed and frightening the fish into spasm, and as they spasm, they scoop the fish up. That thing is so efficient at what that's doing, there's not a chance for anything.
Paul Lines has been fishing off the Suffolk coast for more than 40 years and is leading a campaign to stop these Dutch trawlers from using a controversial technique known as pulse fishing. What angers Paul and other East Coast fishermen is the method of fishing used by this and other trawlers is banned by the EU, yet the Dutch fleet is being encouraged to keep fishing despite that ban. And it's not just UK fishermen who aren't happy. Some of Europe's major conservation groups have concerns too.
We're really worried about the wider ecosystem, the small stuff that's still in the seabed. It could be a more gentler way to catch our fish, but there are so many questions still remaining as to what the effects are on the whole ecosystem of the sea, and that's what concerns us most of all.
So why are the Dutch allowed to get away with it? The traditional type of trawling for flatfish drags chains along the seabed. It's destructive. It's also costly as the trawlers use a huge amount of fuel to drag the chains. So a group of Dutch fishermen had the idea of using electric pulses to stun the fish off the bottom. Paul Lines believes this could kill everything on the seabed, and it's banned by most countries in the world. But it is allowed in the EU if it's a scientific experiment. The Dutch fleet has spent millions of euros equipping trawlers with pulse nets. The head of a Dutch fisheries organisation insists it's a good innovation.
So Martin, just explain the gear here and what we're looking at.
Here we have insulation, and this what we call an electrode. Between those you get the electric pulse signal, only short, and it goes from that side to that.
All the way across?
All the way across. The fish is cramping like that, the sole is giving a cramp, and then it swims into the net.
So
Off,
straight in, up,
straight in.
And straight in.
The French, the Belgian, the British fishermen, they say pulse fishing is killing everything on the sea floor, everything that lives in the mud and the sand. Who's telling the truth?
In my opinion, it's most of it's jealousy, because the Dutch have the biggest part of the sole quota. We fish inside of the quota, and what we see is the fish is much more lively when we catch it and when it comes on board. So suppose everybody who's against us was telling the truth, we only should see that fish, but the fish we see is much more lively than we catch with the old beam trawl system.
This started as an experiment with just a handful of boats, but now it's big business.
This is Den Helder on the northern tip of the Netherlands, and trawlers are making their weekly trip back to port to deliver their fish to market.
Pulse fishing uses less fuel, so it's much cheaper than beam trawling, and it's made this fleet profitable again.
Well, this is what it's all about, sole. They land about 30 tonnes a week here, and 70% of this fish will be exported to other EU countries. These boats came into port this morning, and all of them are pulse trawlers. There are 84 of them in the Dutch fleet. Now that begs the question, how many of them do you need to carry out a scientific experiment? This isn't just a scientific trial, is it? It's pulse fishing now on a commercial scale.
Yeah, you're right about it, yeah.
So we shouldn't be kidding ourselves that that's what it is now.
Yeah, that's true. Because it's getting out on a bigger scale, and Otherwise, I think our whole fleet was gone.
This mime of fish being stunned was part of a protest a few weeks ago in Brussels. Conservation groups and fishermen were trying to get European politicians to enforce the ban and stop pulse fishing from continuing under the pretense of scientific research. Paul was there.
I ask everyone here today to take 5 minutes and seriously think what you are voting for and what control you have.
And the European Parliament did agree to tighten up the ban, but this may be years off. So there is still no limit on the number of pulse trawlers in the North Sea. Much of the scientific work is being carried out at the Royal Netherlands Institute of Sea Research. Here they're studying the effects of pulse fishing on both fish and the tiny organisms that live in the seabed.
Emotions has risen so much, and that science has been wiped from the table. We need to fight as scientists to be heard. We know that for flatfish, for instance, we don't see any damage to the fish which are exposed, and we see damage in some of the cod and a few of the whiting. We need to have a scientific understanding of how electricity may harm organisms, so then you have a much stronger scientific basis for making a judgment of what the total effect in this whole ecosystem may be.
But some conservation groups believe science can't provide all the answers.
What we know from in the laboratories is in controlled conditions, it seems to be reasonably benign. But those are controlled conditions studying on a number of 4 or 5 species. The seas contain hundreds of species. These sorts of experiments in the laboratories aren't easy to replicate in the actual sea. So there's where the questions remain.
So what's going to happen to the fleet fishing in the North Sea? Well, not much yet. There'll need to be several more votes before the ban on pulse fishing is enforced. So for now, these boats will carry on operating, and the controversy around this technique will continue. Meanwhile, Paul Lines believes the European Parliament will have to enforce the ban eventually.
All the research has been done by the Dutch for the Dutch to tell the story for the Dutch. It is over for the Dutch fishing industry if they're not allowed to pulse. They'll have to restructure what they do. We're now trying to rebuild the fishing industry in the UK, and my advice to anyone and all the people involved that we want a low